Today's video is going to be extremely important because today I am going to analyze and thoroughly refute an argument that has been used in the United States for the past several years with some pretty drastic implications. You have probably heard this argument or a variation of this argument, and it goes like this. The United States should cease to be the world's policeman, and the United States should cease to care about defending European countries. And the reason that they should do that is multifaceted. The first is that we live an ocean away from Europe, and therefore Europe's problems are not our problems. And the second is that for decades, while the United States has been a part of NATO, there have been several other nations that have been a part of NATO. And the United States has lived up to its obligations in terms of military spending and building a strong defense force. And European nations simply have not lived up to their obligations. And the reason that they have not lived up to their obligations is usually implied to be because European countries are intentionally taking advantage of the United States' goodwill and the United States' willingness to provide defense spending. People say that Europe basically thinks if the United States is paying for such a huge military, the United States will always be willing to come to their aid, and therefore Europe doesn't actually have to worry about investing and defending itself. And this argument is dangerous for a lot of reasons, because the way that it is being used currently is to try to absolve the United States of any responsibility for helping Ukraine win its war against Russia. And it will also likely be used if Russia attacks any NATO countries in Europe, in addition to Ukraine, to try to absolve us of responsibility and keep us from fulfilling our obligations to defend those countries. But this argument, it turns out, while seems very true on the surface, is actually a lot more complex than people give it credit for. And a lot of people never ask the simple but important question. Why are things this way in the first place? Why is it that the United States spends so much on its military and Europe spends so little, when most of the threats to world peace are threats against Europe and not against the United States? And what a lot of people don't realize is that when you follow that question back to its answer, back to its origins, is that it turns out that the system and the world order as it exists today is not an accident, but it's actually something that the United States created and actively encouraged. The problem with most geopolitical discussion in the United States today is that it is devoid of history, because most Americans, unfortunately, don't actually know their own history. And in particular, they don't know their own history in the period leading from World War II to the modern day, which when it comes to international affairs has been a period of immense prosperity for the United States. And in fact, international affairs since World War II has literally made the United States the most prosperous nation in human history. Now, a lot of Americans don't recognize that because they personally feel poor, and that's largely because the wealth in the United States is so concentrated among such a small number of people at the top. But it is indisputable that the United States has become the most prosperous nation in human history on the back of international affairs following World War II. So what I'm going to do in this video is chart a short course of history from World War II to the modern day, particularly in relation to NATO and military spending and the US economy, so that everyone can see clearly why it is that today the United States spends so much on the military and European countries don't. And at the end of that, when you have all the correct facts, then you can decide if this is something you're upset about or not. But I think most Americans get upset about it without actually knowing the history. Now, really quickly, the research and work behind today's episode was made possible by my sponsor, Incogni. If you ever Google yourself, you might be shocked to see how easy it is for people to find your personal details, things that you would never intentionally share with a stranger. A lot of times, all someone needs to know is your name, city, and state to easily pull up your personal details in minutes or even seconds, including sensitive information like your home address. As a YouTuber, I of course found this especially concerning, because I make videos about topics that give a lot of people a vested interest in doing not such nice things to me. But thankfully, Incogni can help. They help address one of the main reasons our data is so easily available all over the internet, which is data brokers, who collect and sell your personal details for a profit. And Cogni makes it easy to remove your data from hundreds of these data broker sites. Then they help monitor those sites to ensure that your data doesn't come back. All you have to do is sign up, give Cogni permission to act on your behalf, and they get right to work, finding, flagging, and demanding that your personal information be deleted. And while the majority of websites can be caught by their automated removal service, Cogni also recently introduced Cogni Unlimited, which takes data privacy even further by giving you unlimited access to submit links to specific sites to Cogni's privacy experts for removal. Most sites are eligible. To try Cogni for yourself, just use the link in the description and my code WARBURG to get a massive 60% discount on an annual plan. Now, back to the video. So when it comes to the period following World War II, there's two very important basic facts that everybody needs to understand. The first is that the European continent was completely devastated by World War II, and the United States was basically completely untouched, leaving the United States a virtual monopoly when it came to things like advanced manufacturing or even simple manufacturing, because in Europe the infrastructure was just so devastated. That's the first fact everybody needs to understand. And the second fact is that following World War II, the United States entered a period of new conflict. We all know this, the Cold War. And following World War II, until the Cold War ended, the Cold War absolutely dominated pretty much everything the United States did. For the United States, the way we approached the Cold War wasn't limited to just being afraid of Soviet nukes. That was, of course, a big part of things, but arguably it wasn't the biggest or most important part of things, at least in the minds of the US government, although it was made into the biggest thing in the minds of the American people because that fear was so palpable, and that fear could be used to get the American people to support the other main objective, which was the suppression of communism across the globe and the prevention of the spread of communism. This fear of the spread of communism, of course, was why we engaged in wars like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, but it is also why NATO military budgets today are the way that they are, and why the United States spends so much, and why Europe spends so little. After Europe was completely devastated, the United States was genuinely afraid that Soviet communism would spread across the European continent, because economic devastation is a big reason why countries ultimately end up going communist. And so the United States embraced a two-pronged strategy to prevent this communism from spreading through Europe and other theaters of the world. That strategy was, at first, we would support the economies of European nations, including Germany, our very recent sworn enemy, at least West Germany, the part we had access to prevent those nations from internally moving towards communism. And then second, we would militarily intervene by putting military forces in Europe to help protect European countries from potential communist incursions. So let's look first at that economic plan, because it's actually really fascinating. And the economic plan and the military plan actually kind of come together, and that's part of the reason NATO spending is the way that it is today. The economic plan was simple. A big reason people moved towards communism was because they were destitute, they were hungry, and irrationally they were looking for any system, any other system than what was currently happening, that would promise them the basics, like food for their family and a roof over their heads, because they lacked those things. And when you lack those things, it sounds very compelling, any system that will give you those things. So the United States came in and provided a lot of economic support through something that's called the Marshall Plan. Most people are very familiar with it. And the idea was that we actually saw giving economic aid to civilians as an integral part of our military strategy. The idea was that you could reduce the size of a communist army you had to fight in two ways. Either you could reduce that communist army militarily by having a stronger military than them, or you could prevent people from becoming communist militants in the first place by preventing their nations from being converted to communism. And so we had this cost center providing foreign aid to other countries that actually turned out to be a benefit center to us, because we got a very good return on investment from the perspective of we prevented ourselves from having enemies accumulate that we might have to fight one day, who, again, we saw as an existential threat to the United States. So foreign aid has a very good purpose. It's not just giving away freebies. And even though it's a good thing to want to give to people out of the goodness of your heart, it's also a good thing to give to people out of the goodness of your heart in a way that also brings benefits to you, because nobody can question whether or not that's a good idea. So that was the economic strategy. And I'm going to explain the military strategy, and you'll see how they come together. The military strategy was multifaceted. During this period following World War II, this is, of course, when we saw the United States getting military bases all across the globe so that we could deploy troops anywhere we wanted to. And basically, a big reason for this was to quell communist uprisings. That is indisputable because that's how we actually use those military forces. Korea, Vietnam, you get the picture. However, another big part of the anti-communist military strategy was the formation of NATO, which was this concept of an attack on any one nation is an attack against all. And the reason that NATO was created was basically out of an acknowledgement that the Soviet Union was far larger and far more powerful than any individual European country. So to sort of deter the Soviet Union from pushing further into Europe, they needed to combine and unite forces. The way this manifested itself, though, is actually extremely fascinating. Because on paper, the NATO countries were supposed to contribute a percentage of their national GDP to their own defense. But in reality, none of them ever really did. And instead, the United States would put its military forces in Europe to protect these countries to help make up for the shortfall of the fact that they were not investing in their own militaries. This is not a new problem. This is a problem, quote unquote problem, that goes all the way back to the beginnings of NATO. What you have to ask then is, why was the United States always willing to turn a blind eye to this? And why did they only start being upset about this when the Cold War was over and the Soviet Union collapsed? And I've just given you part of the answer by revealing the timing. The reality is that during the Cold War, the United States did not have a vested interest in Europe actually having strong militaries, except at individual periods of time when the United States was at war, Korea, Vietnam, when they started getting upset about Europe not investing in its own defense, which I would argue is actually a little bit more of political posturing to satisfy the American people than the actual stance of the US government. You have to realize that the United States at this time looked at every European nation as a nation that could potentially become communist. Again, that's why they were supporting their economies and trying to prevent internal movements towards communism, because in Europe, pretty much every country had a major communist movement at this point in time. And if a country internally converted or moved towards communism, the worst fear of the United States was that those countries would have their own militaries that went over to the other side with them. So the United States was perfectly willing to turn a blind eye as Europe underinvested in its militaries, and they were perfectly happy for a situation where NATO existed on paper in a way that would deter the Soviet Union from invading. An attack against one is an attack against all, while having the United States being the only significant component of all of those different military forces. That worked very much in their benefit, and not just because of the communist element and the potential for military forces becoming communist, but also because at this time across the world, the United States was building a new world order that centered on itself as the dominant military leader. This is when we started putting military bases all across the globe in order to deter communism, but also in order to increase and protect our own trading interests. And it's really at this time that the United States became the global empire that it is today, and that the United States also became the world's reserve currency. And as I've explained in other videos, I won't go into a ton of depth in this one, but when you have a reserve currency status, especially when you have a fiat currency like the United States converted to in this period of time, you have a huge benefit where other nations are willing to lend you basically an unlimited amount of money, and where you can buy goods on borrowed money, you can buy services on borrowed money in a way that other countries that aren't the reserve currency countries can't. And so as the United States was investing and becoming the only predominant military force on the planet, they were doing so with borrowed money that was made possible by the reserve currency status, and it became sort of a self-feeding global system. The United States invested in its military, which made it the most powerful, the most able to protect its trade interests, which helped contribute to it becoming the reserve currency. That reserve currency then allowed the United States to borrow, basically, theoretically, an infinite amount of money, and to use that money to continue funding a massive military, even with deficit spending. So for the United States, it really was not a problem that they were having to invest so much money in developing their military, and that Europe was not sharing its portion of that burden, because for the United States, it was all being done on fiat currency that they probably never really had to pay back anyways. It's important to understand then that the military spending that the United States was using to protect Europe was not an isolated event, but rather part of a broader global system that altogether, again, made the United States the most prosperous nation in all of human history. So in short, during this period of time, it didn't cost us anything to grow our military in the United States, and arguably, it actually turned a profit for us, because we could fund our military expansion with a world reserve fiat currency and then basically inflate the debt out of existence. And that allowed us to become the world power we are today. Even more than this, during this time, it also benefited the United States in their objectives for Europe to not be investing in its military, because every dollar that Europe did not invest in its military, Europe was investing in its economic recovery, which again helped Europe internally have stronger social conditions that would make them much less likely to turn over to the communist side and turn over to the Soviet side. Really a brilliant system, at least for the United States, and it really worked out wonderfully for us. And again, that's why for such a long time, we never complained that NATO was not fulfilling its military obligations. Ironically, not until the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, what you have to think about is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, arguably, the need for NATO actually became much smaller, because the enemy that had to be defended against was not as unified. Russia was much smaller than the Soviet Union. And so arguably, if the United States was okay with Europe not investing enough in NATO prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, they should have been okay with them investing less after the collapse of the Soviet Union too, but in fact it was just the opposite. Once this giant global behemoth in the Soviet Union had been defeated and disintegrated, and the Cold War was ended, the United States now no longer saw a reason or a benefit for its military force to be the one that protected Europe. And so they started increasingly trying to disengage from European politics, from European warfare, and trying to push Europe to support its own defense. You could argue this is for a number of different reasons. One reason is probably that by this point, the United States global empire had been firmly established. We had established ourselves as the dominant military force around the globe, and we are now entering this stage of enjoying our dominance and trying to kind of cut costs and streamline the system to make it more profitable. That's a potential. The potential is also that the United States, without the fear of the Soviet Union hurting them, now no longer cared about European politics, because they no longer believed that a European war could spill over and actually impact Americans at home. And whatever the reasons, the United States started to disengage. You could say that this is a good thing or a logical thing, and I would say you could say that. But the problem was that the way that the United States disengaged increasingly became a blame game on Europe, where we increasingly started saying that Europe was taking advantage of us by relying on us for their national defense. When the reality is that that is the system that we created, that is the system that we encouraged, that is the system that we turned a blind eye to for something like 80 years, and the system that we wanted put in place until it didn't benefit us anymore. Yes, Europe was relying on the United States to defend them, but that is because we created the conditions for that to happen, and we were more than happy for that to happen for over 80 years, because for us, that was a good thing. But now we see this massive benefit center that helped us establish the largest, most prosperous global empire the world has ever seen. We don't see any of those benefits. We just see the costs. Currently in US politics, it has become extremely fashionable to say either implicitly or explicitly that the politicians of the former generations were all just basically incompetent, that they didn't know what they were doing, and that's why the United States got involved in so many foreign wars, and that's why the United States got involved in so much foreign aid, and this was all stuff that was devastating to us as a country, and it never should have been done in the first place. And to be sure, within all of those examples, because there's a lot of them, there are a lot of examples, individual examples of incompetence. But actually, overall, it's undeniable, indisputable that the system worked very well for the United States. It created the most prosperous economy in human history. And of course, it wasn't an unqualified good. There were some people that did some terrible things as a result of all of this, but it also wasn't an unqualified bad. There were some people who used this system to do some very good things for the world. But in either case, the reason we think these former politicians were incompetent, and that now our new politicians are some sort of messiah who is coming to save us from all the stupid people who built the most prosperous country in human history, is simply because we don't know our history. It's simply because we don't even realize that we are actually the global empire that we are. And all these politicians that we are so against from former generations, what they were actually doing made a lot of sense from that standpoint, because they understood that they were building a global empire. They understood why they were doing things like providing foreign aid to help countries reconstruct themselves. They understood how all of these things played together to build American power and American prosperity. But the problem is that modern Americans don't even know that that is the game that their country is playing, because we find it a little bit unpleasant to think of ourselves as an empire. We don't use that word. We don't use that lingo. It's kind of unsettling. And that is causing us to make a lot of bad decisions, undoing all of these things that benefited us so much over previous generations in pursuit of reckless solutions to problems that aren't even real. Now, one could argue, given all the things I've just discussed, that maybe the United States should back away from supporting Europe. Maybe they shouldn't be providing military assistance for a continent that they don't see much of a benefit in. And I would say, you know what, maybe there's an argument to be had there. But if that is going to be the case, it should be morally something that happens slowly over time, with the United States disengaging after Europe has had a chance to get itself to the point where it can defend itself, not before. Because the United States created this system where everybody was basically relying on the United States to protect them. And this system benefited the United States and made us extremely wealthy. But now that the system is no longer as important to us, now that the system is costing us things, now that people like Russia are attacking countries like Ukraine and potentially other countries in Europe, we want to back away because we already collected all the benefits, and if at all possible, we really want to avoid these costs. And you know what? From a cold strategic standpoint, of course that makes sense. But from a moral human standpoint, understanding that the world is not just about empires, but that the world is made up of human beings who live within different countries, and people who live within other countries are just as important as the people who live within ours because they're just as human as we are. It is morally indefensible for the United States to back down now when things are getting hard, for the United States to talk about leaving NATO now when things are getting hard, for the United States to get belligerent towards Europe now that things are getting hard because Europe isn't stepping up to defend itself quite as quickly as we would like, when we created the underlying realities that made them not invest as much in their own defense. One of the things that really gets me as an American is when I hear our politicians here in my country walking around and saying that other countries are ripping us off, that other countries are taking advantage of us. Because I've visited a lot of other countries, and I've seen how people live in the United States compared to how people live in countries outside of the United States. I have seen the difference in quality of standard of living, and the standard of living in the United States is head and shoulders above almost every other country in the world. And so for the United States to say that those people are ripping us off, I actually just don't know why so many Americans are so ready to believe that. I mean, in the world, if a billionaire or the country equivalent of a billionaire goes into a group of poor people, or even not poor people, but people who are middle class and definitely not as well off as him, and he starts ranting and raving about how everybody is taking advantage of him, you better hold on to your wallet, because I can promise you some sort of scam is coming next. Part of the problem, of course, is that I think most Americans just don't know all of these facts. They have tunnel vision, and they only view the world and reality through what they are experiencing today. And because in the United States we elect new leaders so frequently, we don't even really have that many leaders left, whether in Congress or Senate or the president or anywhere, who were around at the time that this global system was being built that benefited us so much. So even our politicians who are ignorant of our own history don't understand all these things and how they play together and what led to the next thing. And so they may even genuinely believe that we are being ripped off. The risk of this isn't just that we make the wrong decisions from a moral standpoint, but that we also actively make decisions, political decisions, that undermine the system that has generated so much prosperity for us, because we don't even understand how that system works. That is exactly what is happening in the United States right now at this very moment with almost every foreign policy that I have seen coming out of the presidential administration. That said, with knowledge, there is hope. Already we have seen a lot of terrible foreign policy decisions be reversed before they had the chance to have the massive negative impact that they could have had if they were followed to their full conclusions. And that is why I think the work that I do on this channel is so important, where I share knowledge about everything going on in the world today and connect it to history rather than intentionally disconnecting it from history, as so many modern politicians like to do. Now, if you appreciate that work and you appreciate what I do on this channel, before you go, could I ask you just one quick favor? Would you consider becoming a patron of this channel and supporting my future work? It's completely voluntary. I don't want you to do that if you can't afford to do it. But for those who can and want to, it's just a way for you to have an opportunity to support the channel. Really appreciate all my patrons. You guys help me keep going and doing what I'm doing. So if you want to learn more, you can scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description of this video. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.